In life, there are moments that define more than just time. They define transition between the old and the new, between the oppressor and the awakened, between control and liberation. Today, we explore such a moment. Not a moment of celebration, but of realization, not driven by noise, but by clarity. India, a land of ancient wisdom, unshakable roots, and unstoppable spirit, has long been the object of Western influence. Colonized, controlled, misunderstood, but there comes a time when the tide turns, when a nation rediscovers its inner discipline, its cultural force, and its collective purpose. This, my brothers and sisters, is about that day. The day the West lost control, forever, not because of anger, not because of revenge, but because of a silent strength, a self-mastery that no foreign power could ever dominate. Let us reflect deeply. Let us understand wisely. And most importantly, let us remember who we truly are. India's awakening is spiritual, not just political. This statement goes beyond the conventional understanding of independence, which is often measured only in terms of political power or military control. What truly changed the course of history was not merely the departure of foreign rulers, but the profound shift within the consciousness of the Indian people. This awakening has been subtle, slow, and deeply rooted in the timeless essence of Indian civilization. It is not something that occurred overnight, nor was it the product of a single movement. It was the result of centuries of accumulated wisdom, pain, struggle, and inner realization. For far too long, India was viewed through the lens of colonizers, fragmented, weak, exotic, and in need of saving. But this narrative was never the full truth. Beneath the imposed layers of control, the soul of India remained intact. That soul is spiritual. It is tied to dharma, to self-realization, to truth beyond material illusions. Colonial powers attempted to suppress this spirit by introducing foreign systems of education, religion, and governance. They sought to replace India's self-knowledge with borrowed ideologies and disconnect its people from their roots. But what they could never fully understand was that the Indian identity was not based on political boundaries. It was built on inner discipline, collective consciousness, and a connection to the eternal. When India began to rise again, it was not just through resistance or rebellion. It was through remembrance. The rediscovery of ancient texts, philosophies, languages, and indigenous systems of knowledge played a vital role. Saints, philosophers, poets, and thinkers started to speak not just of freedom from colonial rule, but of freedom from inner ignorance. Figures like Swami Vivekananda, Aurobindo, and later even Gandhi emphasized the strength that comes from spiritual clarity. They knew that no nation can be truly free unless its people know who they are at the deepest level. This spiritual awakening was not limited to temples or rituals. It showed itself in the form of self-confidence. A new generation emerged that no longer saw itself as inferior to the West. Indian science, art, medicine, and thought began to gain respect again, not because they sought Western validation, but because they stood tall in their own truth. The more India looked inward, the more powerful it became outwardly. And as this awakening spread, it became clear to the West that control was slipping away, not through conflict, but through consciousness. The day the West lost control over India was not marked by a treaty or a battle. It was marked by a shift in the Indian mind, a shift from dependence to self-reliance, from imitation to originality, from silence to voice. Once people awakened to their own worth, they no longer accept foreign definitions of who they should be. This is what made control impossible, because you can dominate land, people, or politics for a time, but you can never dominate a people who have reconnected with their own spirit. India's spiritual awakening continues to influence the world today. Yoga, meditation, Ayurveda, and holistic thinking are now global forces. But more importantly, India is now influencing global conversations not by shouting, but by being. That is the quiet power of spiritual awakening. It doesn't need permission and it doesn't seek revenge. It simply rises, And in that rising, it dissolves the illusion of control, because when a nation remembers its soul, no empire can hold it down. Cultural sovereignty has replaced colonial dependency. This transformation is not a symbolic gesture. It is a complete realignment of mindset, identity, and direction. For centuries, colonial rule in India was not only about the extraction of resources or the imposition of laws. It was a psychological operation designed to make a civilization doubt its own worth. Through education systems that glorified European achievements while diminishing Indian ones, through legal and political systems that disconnected Indians from their native traditions, and through media and narratives that painted the West as superior, dependency was cultivated and internalized. The colonizers didn't just occupy land, they occupied the mind, and for a long time, that occupation was so complete that even after political independence, cultural dependency remained. But over time, a silent yet profound revolution began to take shape. Indians started questioning the stories they had been told about themselves. Why did we stop wearing our traditional clothing in professional settings? Why was speaking in English considered a sign of intelligence, while fluency in Sanskrit, Tamil, or Urdu was dismissed? Why were our rituals seen as primitive and our sciences as superstition? The answers to these questions began to unravel the lies of colonial influence. A new consciousness emerged, one that no longer sought validation from the West, but turned instead to its own roots for clarity and pride. This return to cultural authenticity is not a rejection of modernity, but a redefinition of it. India is no longer trying to become a poor copy of Western nations. It is shaping a modern identity grounded in its own civilizational ethos. Today, one can see Indian art, cinema, fashion, literature, and music proudly rooted in native tradition while still being globally relevant. Whether it's a Bollywood film that celebrates folk storytelling, a fashion line that revives ancient textiles, or a global yoga community that honors its Indian origins, the shift is clear. Cultural expression is no longer borrowed, it is owned. Language, too, is reclaiming its power. Indian languages are being revitalized through regional cinema, literature, education, and social media. Movements are pushing for native language instruction in schools and the decolonization of academic syllabi. This is not a matter of nostalgia. It is a form of intellectual and emotional sovereignty. When a people speak their own tongue with pride, they reclaim their world. The way language frames thought, values, and relationships cannot be overstated. Cultural sovereignty means the lens through which a nation sees itself is no longer filtered through foreign ideologies. Religious and spiritual traditions that were once mocked or dismissed as outdated are also experiencing resurgence. Practices like Ayurveda, meditation, and temple architecture are being studied, preserved, and modernized. India is realizing that its ancient systems hold not just historical value but futuristic potential. The world is turning to India for answers to mental health, environmental balance, and spiritual clarity, answers that have been encoded in its cultural DNA for millennia. And as these systems gain global recognition, India stands not as a consumer of borrowed ideologies, but as a contributor of profound wisdom. The most powerful aspect of this transformation is its subtlety. There are no revolutions in the streets, no dramatic upheavals. Instead, there is a quiet, steady reclaiming of what was always ours. Schools are changing, art is evolving, conversations are shifting. Youth are more aware of their roots, not in a rigid or exclusionary way, but with pride and purpose. They are not ashamed of the past, they are drawing strength from it. This is what it means to move from colonial dependency to cultural sovereignty. It is not about hatred of the other. It is about love for the self, the land, the language, and the legacy that defines a people. The West underestimated India's inner resilience. On the surface, colonial powers believed they had subdued a fragmented land. rich in resources but lacking unity. They saw divisions in language, caste, region, and religion as weaknesses they could exploit, assuming that such a society could never rise with a single voice. They underestimated the silent power of a civilization that has endured countless invasions, assimilations, and disruptions across thousands of years. What they saw as disunity was, in reality, diversity. What they considered backwardness was often a deeper wisdom not easily understood through Western lenses. India's strength was never loud or reactive. It was internal, patient, and rooted in something far older than modern geopolitics. When colonizers came, they believed that by dismantling India's institutions and replacing them with European systems, they could erase the native mind. They dismantled ancient educational centers, banned native practices, and ridiculed spiritual traditions. They believed that by controlling the narrative, they could control the future. What they didn't understand is that India doesn't operate through surface-level imitation. Its traditions, philosophies, and moral codes are woven into the daily life of its people. Even when external forms were stripped away, the inner life remained alive, preserved in rituals, oral traditions, family customs, festivals, and most importantly, memory. Resilience was not just about resistance, it was about remembrance. The power of India's inner resilience is that it does not require conflict to survive. It adapts, it absorbs, it transforms. When Western systems were imposed, India found ways to integrate them without losing its own soul. This is why even under British rule, Indian leaders and thinkers began using Western education not to glorify the empire, but to challenge it. The same English that was meant to enslave Indian minds became the language of rebellion. The same legal systems introduced to control the population were used to build arguments for independence. This ability to transform the very tools of oppression into instruments of liberation is a hallmark of deep cultural strength. Even more astonishing was the spiritual resilience of the people. Colonizers dismissed Indian faith traditions as superstitions, attempting to convert the population or shame them into abandoning their beliefs. But those beliefs were not merely religious. They were systems of living rooted in deep cosmology and ethics. Through the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and other sacred texts, generations of Indians retained a worldview that transcended the physical. They saw their suffering not as a defeat, but as part of a longer journey. The idea of karma, dharma, and inner awakening gave them the strength to endure what seemed unbearable. This is not passive endurance. It is philosophical power, a kind of strength that cannot be broken by political force. What the West failed to grasp is that India's history is cyclical, not linear. While Western empires saw time as a march forward toward domination and progress, India saw time as a cycle of rise, fall, and renewal. This world, you allowed Indians to endure dark periods without losing hope. The belief that truth always reemerges, that Dharma will eventually prevail, gave the people a kind of inner calm even in moments of national trauma. While others saw submission, there was actually deep preparation taking place mentally, culturally, and spiritually. Today, that resilience has fully reawakened. India is not just surviving, it is asserting. It is doing so not with the bitterness of revenge, but with the clarity of purpose. Its voice on the global stage is more confident, its people more united in spirit, and its culture more proudly expressed. The foundations that seemed weakened have revealed themselves to be unshakable. That is the nature of true resilience. It is often invisible until it is tested, and once tested, it shows that what was thought to be broken was only biding its time to return stronger than before. Economic and technological independence is irreversible now. For decades, India's economic model was shaped by foreign interests, first by colonial powers who extracted wealth on an unimaginable scale, and then by post-independence structures that were heavily influenced by Western economic theories and global power dynamics. But the tide has turned. India has moved from being a consumer in the global economy to a creator, from dependency on imports and foreign investments to building indigenous capacity across sectors. This transformation has not been merely transactional, it has been deeply strategic, laying the groundwork for a future in which India cannot be economically coerced or technologically manipulated. The earliest signs of this shift began with liberalization in the 1990s, a period that opened India to global markets. While the West may have seen this as an opportunity to expand their own influence, India used it as a stepping stone to learn, adapt, and innovate. Over the decades, India didn't just participate in the global economy, it began to shape it. From IT services and pharmaceuticals to space technology and digital infrastructure, the country quietly built an ecosystem that is now not only self-sustaining but globally competitive. These gains were not gifted. They were earned through a combination of talent, ambition, and an unwavering belief in self-reliance. One of the clearest indicators of irreversible independence is the digital revolution. India has created one of the most sophisticated digital public infrastructures in the world. Initiatives like Aadhaar, UPI, and Digital India have fundamentally changed how governance, banking, healthcare, and education are delivered. What makes this unique is that these technologies were built for scale, inclusion, and accessibility, not just for profit. While Western nations grapple with the unintended consequences of monopolistic tech ecosystems, India has created tools that empower individuals, not just corporations. This is not just technological advancement, it is a form of digital sovereignty. In manufacturing and defense, India is also changing the narrative. Make in India movement is not a slogan, it is a vision. Indigenous production of semiconductors, electronics, renewable energy components, and defense equipment is no longer aspirational, it is operational. India is now a key player in global supply chains, and more importantly, it's becoming less dependent on any one country or bloc. This diversification is a shield against global volatility and a statement that India's economy is no longer hostage to the will of others. Perhaps the most important development is the psychological shift in the Indian entrepreneurial spirit. There was a time when the West was seen as the only benchmark for success. That is no longer true. Startups and innovators in India are creating solutions for uniquely Indian problems, solutions that are now being exported to the world. The youth no longer dream only of jobs in multinational corporations. They dream of building companies, technologies, and ideas that can change the world. This shift in mindset is irreversible because it is no longer dependent on external validation. It is fueled by confidence, rooted in cultural pride, and driven by purpose. India's relationship with foreign powers has also evolved. It no longer enters negotiations from a position of weakness. Whether in trade, climate agreements, or technology partnerships, India brings strength to the table, not just in numbers, but in ideas. It is a market, a laboratory, and a talent pool rolled into one. This blend of economic scale and intellectual capital makes India indispensable to the global order, and that means no one can afford to dictate terms to it anymore. This irreversible trajectory is not the result of one government or one leader. It is the cumulative momentum of 1 billion people choosing to believe in themselves, and once a nation begins to build its destiny with its own hands, no external power can truly control its future. India leads by identity, not imitation. This shift marks a deep civilizational transformation, where the country has moved beyond trying to replicate the West to embracing its own path with confidence. For a long time, India's engagement with modernity was defined by mimicry. From governance models and legal systems to fashion, education, and even aspirations, the Western template was considered superior. The legacy of colonial rule had left a subconscious belief that progress meant looking and acting like those who once ruled over us. But over time, India began to realize that true progress does not come from denial of one's heritage, but from the intelligent integration of tradition with modern needs. This realization emerged gradually. It started in art and culture, where Indian creators began fusing classical forms with modern storytelling. Musicians blended ancient ragas with contemporary beats. Filmmakers told deeply Indian stories through global formats, and designers rediscovered handlooms and indigenous textiles, transforming them into statements of pride. The West had often labeled these expressions as outdated or exotic, but India began reclaiming them as symbols of resilience and originality. Imitation slowly gave way to authenticity, and authenticity, when expressed confidently, commands global respect. This identity-based leadership is also visible in India's diplomatic stance. Unlike in the past, where India's foreign policy often tried to align with dominant global powers, today India speaks from a place of self-assurance. It does not swing blindly toward any one alliance. It defines its interests independently. Whether in trade, defense, climate negotiations, or global governance reforms, India's position is not about choosing sides but about setting terms. This confidence does not come from arrogance. It comes from a deeper clarity of who we are as a nation, what our values are, and what we bring to the table. India's educational and intellectual landscape is also transforming. Young minds are no longer taught to revere only Western philosophers, scientists, and historians. There is growing awareness of the depth of Indian knowledge systems, from mathematics and astronomy to philosophy, medicine, and political thought. Ancient texts like the Arthashastra, Manus, Smriti, Yoga Sutras, and the Upanishads are being re-examined not as relics, but as sources of sophisticated insight. Schools and universities are gradually shifting from a Eurocentric world to one that includes and honors indigenous perspectives. This doesn't mean rejecting the West, it means standing equal to it. On the world stage, India's soft power now comes from being fully itself. Yoga is not just an exercise trend, it's a philosophical system rooted in Indian identity. Ayurveda is no longer dismissed as folk medicine but studied as a holistic health science. Spiritual tourism in India grows not because India is trying to be like somewhere else, but because it is offering what no other place can. Even India's approach to technology, where inclusivity and public good are emphasized over monopoly and profit, reflects a distinctly Indian ethic, one shaped by values of community, simplicity, and interdependence. This leadership through identity is most powerful because it is sustainable. Imitation leads to fragility. It depends on the mood of others, on external benchmarks, on a desire to fit in. But leadership grounded in identity cannot be shaken by trends or opinions. It is rooted like the banyan tree, flexible but firm, ancient yet always growing. When a nation leads through its own identity, it becomes a source of inspiration rather than a follower of fashion. It creates new models rather than copying old ones, and in doing so, it frees not only itself, but also encourages other nations to rediscover and reclaim their own voices. India no longer needs to prove itself by Western standards. It sets its own. The world listens not because India imitates the powerful, but because it remembers it has always been powerful in its own way.